So a little bit about myself. I did my original training after studying electrical engineering here in Michigan. I did graduate studies at MIT, also in electrical engineering with an emphasis in applied probability. My graduate advisor gave me some of the best advice in my career, and when I finished up my PhD, before taking a faculty position, she strongly encouraged me to do a postdoctoral study in something wildly different. And so that led to me doing a postdoctoral study in neuroscience, working with Mri Brown. And so Mri is a practicing anesthesiologist at Mass General Hospital, professor at Harvard, but he also has a PhD in statistics and a practicing and a neuroscientist at MIT. And so what that allowed me to do is to start to understand anesthesia and neuroscience, but from the lens of applied probability and statistics, where I was originally trained. And so as I transitioned to a career in academia, I operated at the intersection of not only neuroscience and applied mathematics, but also getting involved in some technology development. So if we stand back to think about a motivating application, if we think about obstructive sleep apnea, one of the things that we may not know is that 1 in 5 people in America, it turns out, have obstructive sleep apnea. Moreover, about 90% of these people are undiagnosed. And if we think about the consequences of undiagnosed sleep apnea, they're manifold. Thinking about workplace accidents, motor vehicle accidents, obviously comorbidities with other diseases. And when you add it all up, it totals about $150 billion in 2015. If we think about how is this typically diagnosed, well, there's something called polysomnography, where they send you to a sleep lab and they instrument you pretty much with everything known to man. And when you take a look at this picture, imagine if you're trying to get a good night's sleep. There's a saying in physics that in the process of measuring a system, you're going to undoubtedly perturb it, and I think this picture communicates that very well. And so this is not so pleasing, and so stories like this are what interested us in getting involved in technology development so that we can miniaturize the way we collect this data, which then introduces interesting opportunities for data analysis. So we demonstrated the capabilities such as these sensors that you see here, and what we should take away from here is this is how the future is beginning to unfold and the way that we can start to make electronic monitoring systems that are flexible and unobtrusive. And with these devices, you can measure a variety of things. And so, for example, you can measure things like the ECG from the chest, skin temperature, along with the EEG from the forehead, as shown. So in addition, recent things that we've been involved in since then is focusing on the ability to have wireless transmission. And so we've designed new antennas with mesh structures for stretchability that can be embedded again in flexible adhesives, and when adhered to the skin can transmit over 200 feet away via Bluetooth. And so another aspect that many people are focusing upon these days is the ability to have scalable ways to embed sensors and adhesives to mount to the body, but to also have modularized approaches to embed chips for things like memory, data processing, and encoding for wireless transmission. And when we add all this up, if we can do this in ways that are scalable and compatible with roll-to-roll processing, perhaps these types of technologies can be in the hands of everyone. When you add it all up, you can end up having devices that look like this, where you have a strain gauge and integrated circuits for encoding and processing for wireless transmission. Now, the things I've sort of told you so far relate to the sensor, integration of the ICs and antennas, but as we all know, energy is still a challenge. Luckily, there are many increasing applications to take companies that are building flexible, stretchable batteries. For example, Panasonic recently announced flexible batteries particularly tailored for wearable applications. And so with these capabilities, we can start to ask ourselves, what types of interesting ways can we analyze this data? And so what I'd like to do for a minute is quote Michael Jordan, who said, I think data analysis can deliver inference at certain levels of quality, but we have to be clear about what levels of quality. We have to put error bars around our predictions. And what I mean by that is if you take a look at those two curves right there, notice that the same red dot is the maximizer. So if we think about a maximum likelihood estimate or a maximum a posteriori estimate, but notice that one curve is sharper than the other. So in sort of quantifying the uncertainty in our estimate, one is better than another. Now, Michael Jordan, the basketball player, didn't say this, but Michael Jordan, the famous statistician at UC Berkeley that some of us know, was the one who said it. So just see if you guys are paying attention. So in any case, this is an application that we have expressed interest in being able to not only provide point estimates that describe the most likely description of what's taking place, but developing efficient ways to quantify uncertainty, which is particularly relevant for physiologic data. And so one of the recent things that we've been involved in is using some applications from the theory of optimal transport. And I guess the simplest way for me to communicate this is, let's imagine that we have a bunch of balls that are universally placed, as you can see up top, and I would like to build some type of board where through the force of gravity and from them bouncing around this Plinko board, they can result in having another shape as you see at the bottom. So how do we develop transport maps that can do this? And it turns out we can leverage the theory of optimal transport. And one of the things that our graduate student Diego has been able to do is he's been able to do this so that we can now start to build upon what Michael Jordan told us with uncertainty quantification, more importantly, using tools from convex optimization to do this. And so we have some new results that basically say that if you can give me any algorithm that can get to build a certain type of point estimate, we can concatenate those, and by using a distributed type of implementation, we can actually now provide a system that can draw samples from the posterior distribution and thus allow you to quantify uncertainty. And actually, we build this on top of Amazon Web Services types of systems. And so that sort of gives us an example of what we mean about uncertainty quantification, and I'd like to emphasize about within the context of wearables how that's very important. So if we stand back and we think about the way most wearables sort of work right now, it turns out that the energy ends up being a challenge. And so typical wearables right now digitize the data, do some basic processing of it, wirelessly transmit that data to the cloud, and using the types of algorithms that I mentioned previously, turn that data into information to quantify uncertainty. Now, some of the challenges with that, however, though, are that that process will undoubtedly drain your batteries. If you want a little thin, flexible battery about the same form factor as your wearable, you're going to run into problems. So one of the things that we can take advantage of is the fact that the chips inside of our iPhone today have more computational power than the supercomputers for Apollo 13 of the past. And fast forwarding, if we take a look at new chips that are being designed, these very small, thin chips that are about the size of a grain of sand, it turns out, have immense computational capability. And so our graduate student Marcella has led some efforts in being able to build not only point estimation procedures, but full uncertainty quantification algorithms that can be implemented on these extremely thin, energy efficient chips. And what this leads to is, rather than analog to digital conversion, what I like to call analog to information conversion, where we can actually grab this data and turn that data into information all inside of the wearable device, also known as analytics at the edge, and only transmit data to the cloud when necessary. And this has extra added benefits in terms of not only reducing battery consumption, but also thinking from a privacy and security perspective. So if we go back to the application of obstructive sleep apnea that I mentioned, we have a collaboration with Bob Owens in pulmonary and critical care. And basically what we've been doing is we've been trying to take a look at the current workflow of how assessing sleep looks like. And as I mentioned before, you go inside of the sleep lab and they instrument you like crazy. They collect this data, and then they do some data analysis. Trained humans take 30-second by 30-second epic of this data while you're asleep, and from this they stage the sleep and create something like a hypnogram, and from that they can perform clinical and decision support. So the first step, as you can imagine, is removing all that instrumentation, and one of the things that we focused upon is a simple system where you can just mount a multi-electrode patch onto the forehead. And with that multi-electrode patch, we were able to assess qualitatively the type of data that we can get. So each of these waveforms, the brownish looking waveform, comes in a side-by-side comparison based upon conventional EEG, and the green waveform comes from our flexible electronic device. And if you focus for a minute, let's say on stage N2, you can clearly see that we can pick up the K complex and the spindle with the green waveform. And in the bottom pair, looking at rapid eye movements, you can pick up those as well. So that sort of qualitative assessment suggests that these types of new miniaturized technologies can pick up some aspects of sleep, but the next question becomes what type of quantitative analyses can we do? And then one of the things that we were particularly interested in is understanding if we can develop automated algorithms to do this, as compared to the typical approach of using humans looking at all of those physiologic waveforms collected from a sleep lab. So in that regard, one of the things that we've been taking a look at is how do we even represent the data from a time and frequency perspective? One of the things that we do know is that in different stages of sleep, different frequency bands of the activity, different oscillatory bands typically are active, and how can we get better resolution with that? And so using some approaches from multi-taper spectral analysis allows us to get better contrast in the time frequency representation of the data. One of the other things that we spent some time doing is performing density estimation to take a look at the energy in different bands of sleep, in this place gamma and beta. If we take a look at stage S3 from a collection of data and a training data set, we start to see that there's sort of structured multimodal aspects of what takes place, suggesting that just standard Gaussian-based statistics are not sufficient. And so we've developed some new density estimation algorithms that are compatible with the large-scale infrastructure that I mentioned before, building upon convex optimization. And also in the spirit of Michael Jordan and going from point estimates to full uncertainty quantification, the work of my graduate student Marcella, who's actually done all of this in hardware, has been able to not only provide sort of point estimates about what aspects of the sleep, the amount of energy in any frequency band at a point in time, but to actually provide an uncertainty cloud so we can see that. So each one of these dots right here represents samples from the posterior, in-stage REM versus in-stage light. And this provides more information for us to make decisions. And this picture here sort of makes that clear. So what we're demonstrating right here is basically the histogram of losses, where here we're using the log loss. And if we just use a standard lasso, taking advantage of the fact that we know during sleep there's a small number of frequency bands that are active, so we can incorporate that into a compressed sensing style framework. If we just use a point estimate lasso style procedure, what I'm plotting is a histogram of the losses. And ideally, the histogram should be bunched closer to the left, but as you see, the gray plot has some losses that are further to the right, whereas when we use a fully Bayesian procedure, taking samples from the posterior, we see that the histogram is much further to the left, demonstrating the added value that you get from uncertainty quantification. So when you sort of add all this up, one of the things that we have been paying attention to is asking ourselves, how well of a job can we do in staging sleep when we use all of these different instruments, right? And moreover, using clinically trained humans to stage the sleep. And what you get is a picture, as you see in blue. Now, on that same human being, we compare that to just having electrodes on the surface of the forehead and developing some of our automated algorithms that involve multi-taper spectrograms, density estimation, sparse signal processing, and hidden Markov models. And you see this waveform in red, this sleep staging in red. And this is still a qualitative comparison, but we do have some quantitative assessment as well, where we can take a look at things such as the sensitivity in different stages of sleep, et cetera. And one of the things that we're excited about is if we take a look at some of the work that uses even a full shower cap of EEG and automated staging algorithms, the types of performance that we have are commensurate, or very close to that. And so what that means, if we think about the future as it relates to this 90% of people that go undiagnosed with sleep apnea, the story that we're trying to tell is, let's imagine if now the doctor can actually send you home and send a device to you, and we can measure your sleep and assess your sleep apnea in the comfort of your own home. And so that's the direction that we're trying to go with this and intervene when necessary. So that's one example of what we've been working on, and I would like to pivot to our second example, and this involves a collaboration with two MDs within the context of gastroenterology, and so an adult gastroenterologist, David Kunkel, as well as a pediatric, Hayat Musa, and my graduate student, Armin Garabans. And I'd like to brag about Armin for a minute. This work won him the prestigious Siebel Scholars Award. So Tom Siebel, a billionaire, gives $35,000 awards to 80 graduating PhD students across the country for innovative research, and Armin won the Siebel Scholar Award for this work. And the high-level story goes as follows, right? If you take a look at Bob, he's having some GI problems. So he visits his primary care physician, and maybe he's having pain, or nausea and bloating, vomiting, or constipation. And so if you visit your primary care physician, it turns out it's a very subjective, guess and check sort of purpose. And so we can ask ourselves, is Bob unique? Well, the punchline is no. It turns out that 10% of people, when they visit their primary care physician, are visiting because of some type of GI problem, and the annual cost is on the order of about $150 billion. So if Bob goes through this iterative process before things are solved and ends up with his gastroenterologist secondary visit, here's what a typical gastroenterologist will do. The punchline is that everything I'm showing you is invasive. They either give you an endoscope, all right, and this endoscope is invasive, and it does one of two things. It basically tries to image to see if there's a physical blockage, or sometimes can take some type of biopsy. The most common thing that's done is they give you a gastric emptying test. And so basically what this does is they force you to drink something that's radioactive. They send you over to nuclear medicine, and they image and they take a look at how much time it takes before this clears out of your stomach to see if your stomach has delayed emptying. And in some cases, they do very sophisticated manometry procedures, which are also invasive, that measure pressure in different parts of the stomach and the small intestines. So one question we could ask ourselves, and this is what I like to motivate this, let's imagine where the field of cardiology was if we didn't have ECG. It would be a problem. And so the punchline is that that's basically where we are right now. Now there is something called an electrogastrogram, where they place 3 electrodes over the surface of your abdomen, and it turns out that if your stomach is operating normally, right, it's the myoelectric cells, the pacemaker cells in your stomach operate at about 0.05 hertz. So when you do a time frequency picture, you should see a red band at about 0.05 hertz. But it turns out that even if it is squeezing at that rate, if there are functional problems with how the different cells are operating, just like in cardiology, this procedure is useless. So the bottom line is that this electrogastrogram is not used at all clinically. And so we asked ourselves, why is that the case? And so there are some expert gastroenterologists from Vanderbilt University that just as early as January 2016 basically said that it is impossible to be able, non-invasively with a multi-electrode recording, to measure anything of functional significance in the GI system. We still were ambitious and wanted to pursue this, and Armin, taking insight from our friend Laplace, was able to use a multi-electrode recording, and with this multi-electrode recording was able to use some basic ideas from the laws of physics, and with a multi-electrode recording we can actually infer this wave of activity. So we can start to infer the functional aspects of the GI system and do things like infer the direction of wave propagation as well as the speed, which indeed has functional significance. And to make that more clear, we've done some MRI validation with a patient who had gastroparesis, which means delayed gastric emptying, and basically the contraction, direction, and speed that we estimated non-invasively was confirmed with MRI. Along with that, we did a side-by-side comparison where we took patients that were clinically diagnosed with gastroparesis based upon the radioactive gastric emptying test, and with our procedures of estimating the direction as well as the speed, you see some monotonic trends. And so, for example, a healthy control, you see this very structured pattern of sort of right to left, which is the orientation of the stomach. So functionally, the myoelectric cells are propagating in the right direction. The speed is about 5.5 millimeters per second. Someone with moderate gastroparesis, we see the speed slowing down, 3.1 millimeters per second, and you see that the origination of the wave is starting to go in the opposite direction. And then one of these patients that has severe gastroparesis, we see this very sort of wild, random coordination functionally of what's taking place. We actually have, in addition, done a side-by-side comparison with a patient, a pediatric patient, that was being measured for manometry, a patient who had severe constipation. And after we take our multi-electrode recordings and perform some blind source separation types of procedures, we can actually basically estimate the pressure that's being recorded invasively based upon our non-invasive recordings. And so what you see in this picture in the right is that red curve represents the power after we perform some blind source separation, and each one of those blue vertical bars corresponds to the pressure measured invasively with this manometry procedure. And one of the things that really excites us about this is, for example, this manometry procedure, no adult in San Diego County or even in Orange County can get this. And in fact, you have to go to LA County to get this. And so it's only done in children in San Diego, but imagine if we can replace that with just some multi-electrode recordings over the abdomen. And speaking of ambulatory monitoring, we've done some preliminary validation with this. So using some of these flexible electronics recordings, as I mentioned before, we can actually record that, that gastric signal. And with this ambulatory monitoring, we've been able to do some fun applications of what I call N=1 data science, meaning if we can record someone for a long period of time, rather than trying to record for many people and averaging, we can actually infer the dynamics of taking place in an individual subject and gather interesting insights. And so, for example, the top two pictures, what you see are spectrograms, and if you focus on that 0.05 hertz, you see some variability, some sort of in and out of the redness in the vicinity of 0.05 hertz, and that's somewhat, related to our circadian rhythm because of the fact that we know that there's intrinsic variability in our heart rate. If you focus on the bottom patient, notice that there's this persistent 0.05 hertz extremely red, and that's manifested also in the picture on the right. And so it turns out that this had important clinical significance. So that patient, it was determined, independent of what we had done, to have something that's called a pseudo-obstruction, which means that there is not a physical blockage, but there is a functional blockage in terms of the coordination of the pacemaker cells along the stomach. And this is very common, and if you do an endoscopy, you don't see an obstruction, yet you see these people that have delayed emptying and they have all this constipation and all these problems. And so if you take a look at the 0.05 hertz signature, you see that persistent redness in the gastric signal. And this is very important, and our collaborator was extremely excited about this because this is a situation, if once they can determine the problem, they know how to treat this. For example, with a Botox injection or with a balloon dilation. And we have more examples like this. And so this combination of data science and ambulatory monitoring is creating unique opportunities. And so to summarize, what I'd like to say is that the status quo right now within the field of GI has basically been a long time of subjective testing, going back and forth, try this, try that, let me know what you feel. Then after all that fails, you get referred to your gastroenterologist, and at that point they give you objective but very invasive types of testing. And our gastroenterology collaborator, for example, has a 3-month delay on being able to get new patients. If we can imagine now that we can reduce that window of time of subjective testing and have an intermediate stage of objective but non-invasive testing with the types of things that I mentioned, this can reduce the burden on those gastroenterologists and only when necessary move forward to objective and invasive testing. And so to summarize my last slide, what I'd like to speak to is I talked about sleep in isolation, I talked about GI function in isolation, but we know that all of these things are related to each other. And so for example, our brain, our heart, our stomach, our GI system are interconnected via our vagus nerve and whatnot, and things such as stress modulate all of these. So does our diet, our environment, and the implications on behavior. And so one of the things that we're beginning to do is to take these, these individual projects that we've been focused upon and trying to merge these together with public health. And so one example about this, and I like to brag about another Michigan alum named Tiffany Powell. Tiffany was an engineer at Michigan who went on to go to get an MD as well as a master's in public health, and she's now an intramural researcher at NIH, and she's very much interested in cardiovascular disease, obesity, and public health. And she had a recent study that talked about the importance of, it's called zip codes and waistlines, and basically if you take the same people, same behaviors, and just put them into a new environment, that has a drastic implication on their waistline and their weight and their health. And so one of the things that we're increasingly interested in is taking the data science as well as these new types of these tools and connecting it to questions about environment, diet, and behavior to create a more global understanding of what's taking place and to identify optimal ways to try to intervene. And so with that, I conclude my talk.
and we can help, that can help us to understand the causes of the human diseases, and also develop a precision medicine and prevention strategies, and also better health policies. So now I'm going to